a call that's simply placed and maybe the person may be expecting it, may not be. But if that person's getting 10 to 15 spam calls a day and a number appears they don't recognize, it's just not going to get answered.
Hi, I'm Marianne Bohr with HIMS. Today I'm joined by Maury Monroe, Transaction Network Services, or TNS, Communications Market Vice President of Enterprise Sales, and we'll be talking about protecting healthcare organizations and patients from voice channel fraud in 2025. Before we start, I want to say thank you to Transaction Network Services for sponsoring this podcast. Maury, thanks for joining us today.
Appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Now, Maury, TNS says that trust in the voice channel needs to be restored. In your opinion, what caused that trust to decline in the first place?
I think it's a pretty simple equation that just translated to too many inbound calls into everybody's personal mobile devices. We recognize that the volume of calls has exponentially increased, and as a result of those calls, since the majority of them were not calls expected by the recipient, it turned out the majority of them became the robocalls that we are all too familiar. We recognize that even selling tactics included this cold calling approach that disregarded even people attempting to tell people to take them off of a list per se. And we've also started to witness an exploitation of the consumer, the end user of the call. And in that really exponentially increased that loss of trust is as somebody answering a call recognize that that might not be the individual that they thought it was, or somebody's tactics to solicit them were bad actors. And as that happened, everyone became a lot more protective and decided, in most cases, if a name didn't appear, I'm not going to answer. And there were good calls that were missed in there as well, and creating the problems that we experience today.
Absolutely. And why are healthcare organizations more at risk in comparison with other industries?
I mean, it's healthcare is a very patient doctor relationship focused business. I mean, we trust the conversations and the interactions that we have with any healthcare organization as it's imperative that we get a fair conversation, an expected conversation, because our health depends on it. And transfer of information is lost by way of it being a call that was maybe not answered. It's the worst possible outcome, especially if it's a call that is potentially dependent on somebody's health. So we want to recognize the issue and start to understand how it's negatively affecting such a critical vertical that needs calls answered. We get calls that could misrepresent insurance and that they themselves are even concerned if some of those calls, while healthcare related, have to do with the financial clearing of information. And that in and of itself is very impactful to the end user, not to be discounted at all. And so healthcare organizations at a dependency of having a call answered is easily one of the most critical as it just pertains to our everyday health.
You know, you think about so many healthcare calls being, like you said, time sensitive if you're waiting for someone to authorize treatment or,
Mhm.
to consent to something that could certainly cause some delays in care that could have some negative
Yeah.
impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it expands into not just maybe a hospital calling you, but other branches of the medical vertical that need to interact with you. If it's effectively a prescription that, you want to get before the store closes, or something related to a question around how well you're doing. It's not hard to imagine the scenarios. And while you're not maybe feeling at the top of your game, you're having to screen your calls. And that's not your desired outcome. I mean, you want to know who's calling at that point, probably more so than at any other time. And you don't have the patience, or you are highly susceptible to potentially somebody taking advantage of you. So look at all those factors and think about your own interactions and how it applies, because we want to represent healthcare organizations, but ironically, we're all consumers as well. So we can see both sides of how we help. And if you're sitting there knowing you're susceptible, don't you put that responsibility on the healthcare organization to protect you. And we need to emphasize that because as consumers, it's going to get harder to defend yourself as synthetic voice and some other things we'll talk about become at the forefront of how you could be exploited.
Absolutely. Now, Maury, has TNS technology been deployed by healthcare organizations before? And if so, what were some of the benefits of the organization?
We have absolutely represented the healthcare vertical, specifically with a national healthcare provider. We know that they needed to reach their patients to determine the level of care that was required, and so their calls were specifically dependent, as I mentioned, on the health of their customers, their clients, and it became it became pretty impactful. So much so that just during the trial, they saw a 41% increase in the calls answered. So when you're I mean, you're dealing with that kind of response, that kind of improvement of an answered call, it changes situations where it definitely becomes tremendously impactful to the end customer wanting that call. We had we've even talked to prospective customers that represent governmental organizations, representing large, of course, government healthcare institutions. And you could imagine somebody sitting by the phone and it not being represented with the name of the institution they're waiting for the call from. And it could be that much of a miss that by not displaying the name would result in a missed call of that person having to call back, unfortunately, into that government organization and possibly being on hold for another 3 hours. Think about the inverse. If you missed the call and you actually wanted it, but because you didn't recognize something and you maybe thought it was a spam, you're susceptible to being apprehensive and not just expecting a call that you waited for quite a while and being able to answer. So our our involvement can be very impactful, and we, through even our customers, have witnessed this translating to fewer total calls for our customers. So they actually reduced their outbound call volume simply because the calls they made got answered. And then as they did that, rapport was built, trust was built, the brand was built. So by simply displaying the name at the most minimal level, we can expand into additional products that also protect from imposters. But we have an ability to make an initial impact, at least tell somebody who you are. And then as you do that, think about the level of protection that will need to be offered. What happens when you can ensure that it's actually the enterprise calling, the healthcare organization making the call? There's going to be an increase in this spoofed or impostered call because consumers have information that bad actors want to exploit. It could be financial information, it could be specific individual information. If they get to that and it's not actually the healthcare organization, where does that responsibility lie? And you know where that could be headed. So this is a collective problem, and by us putting a customer in play, of which we did, a national healthcare organization, we witnessed the immediate impact. I'm not talking about a couple weeks, couple months. You could see it within a couple days. It's such a significant change in behavior that we can demonstrate through something as simple as a name display.
And that was such an impressive boost. I imagine that that would, have ramifications for improving staff satisfaction too. It's got to be frustrating to make call after call and not connect with people.
Yeah, if you're working there and your day is spent getting hung up on or going to voicemail, your answer rate is such that somebody may not see you as a valued commodity, a valued employee. And we want those employees to get the opportunity to talk to the prospective customer they're trying to reach or their client that they already have, that they're supporting. And they can't do that if they don't answer the call. I mean, you could see answer rates below 5% in some cases where it's just a call that's simply placed and maybe the person may be expecting it, may not be. But if that person's getting 10 to 15 spam calls a day and a number appears they don't recognize, it's just not going to get answered. I'm sure you have a preference of whether or not a call comes in as a just a straight number or maybe a name. You're going to answer it with a name. You're going to know who that is. You don't answer your door typically these days without knowing who's there, and you're not going to answer an email without knowing that in fact you recognize the name. We are built on a level of trust due to the exploitation that's out there. Phone calls are no different. We have to change our behavior and associate a name to get the level of trust established, restored in this case, so that calls are answered.
That's such a great point, thinking of it as in terms of answering your door. You wouldn't answer your door if you didn't
No.
know who was there either.
Right. That's why you have different cameras out there to build up a level of trust. It's simple.
Now, Maury, say a healthcare organization doesn't have this technology deployed and say they're now a victim of a phishing attack. What would be the ramifications of that? Not just the organization, but for the patients and customers too.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit earlier just about whose responsibility is it when somebody's effectively exploited for personal information, quite often financial loss. And these types of phishing attacks aren't single threaded. So it may just not be a phone call. They're smart enough to put a text message on first. They call you up and say, hey, maybe you missed that text I just sent you. I'm calling from this healthcare organization. We wanted to follow up on maybe your insurance premiums, whatever. They can devise it. They're very effective. By having an initial seed that might just be an SMS message, you're disarmed because now you got a phone call. And without connecting the two as both being negative, you run into the situation of answering questions tied to it. Hey, I'll resend you that text. Go ahead and tap on this and we'll get the information. Well, that leads them into your phone in ways that you can't control the outcome. So, healthcare organizations have customers that they ultimately need to protect. And the protection, if not provided, could very well come back on these organizations as those customers can associate the issue back to the healthcare organization. And I don't want to say that we're a society that does ultimately lead things back, but in our banking institutions, in our medical, they're going to have similar behaviors of ownership where that issue lies, even if somebody misrepresents themselves intentionally. And so I think that it is imperative that the healthcare organizations across different types of services all understand the exposure that they have to protect their customers and and in something as simple as a phone call, allow them to know it's actually them calling.
Absolutely. You can definitely see where they want to prevent that kind of erosion of patient trust that can be so dangerous.
And the brands themselves have to protect these brands because at the highest level, the risk and the brand and the employee productivity, think about all these things that go into what are critical at the strategic level of these companies. Your employees will be affected, as we just talked about. Your brand is affected. Your employee productivity, your ability to be effective in the market, it all contributes. And it probably takes you 5 minutes to lose and 5 years to restore. So it's a very vicious cycle of how quickly you can fall and how long it takes to restore customer trust. You could just go to a second option at that point. If your bank chose not to protect you, you'll just go to another one. Well, that departure, as we all know, can be very detrimental to the success of these companies and their viability.
Sure. That kind of leads into my next question. Why is now the time for healthcare organizations to start to proactively protect themselves from this kind of potential voice channel fraud?
I would absolutely say that the inroads are already out there, having the fraud itself been established in the financial markets. So by that I say banks have been spoofed. Banks are now witnessing complex attacks on their customers. And by the defenses of companies such as ours going out there and stopping the spoofing or improving name display characteristics, guess where they're going to go? I mean, I hate to say it's a little bit of whack a mole, but they will go to other avenues where exploitation can be conducted. And when that happens, you're effectively, yes, kicking the can down the street, but the exposure will extend to other verticals, other market verticals, and healthcare is probably the second one on the list right after financial. So when you look at the healthcare organizations, they have to begin the protection. Synthetic voices out there. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Synthetic voice is tough because you probably can't tell the difference in all intents and purposes. And if somebody is themselves as somebody you recognize, but it's not actually them, a lot of information could get exchanged to compromise you. And in your healthcare and in your protected information, it's very detrimental to not just you, but your trust in that organization. You would have none. So healthcare organizations, if they haven't already, will be one of the most significantly impacted in a positive way. So we can't forget that. Think about that positive impact. The negative is just as significant, but why not swing the lever and make it a positive experience at an investment that will be so little compared to the detriment, the damage, if not utilized. So I think it's a fair trade from the standpoint of owning the customer relationship, not just as a consumer or a patient, but own the relationship holistically. That includes the protective aspects of interactions via communications. That's going to have to now be the culture we live with. It wasn't previously a responsibility for healthcare organizations to own the name display when you had a home phone. We aren't in the same culture. We aren't in the same technology when terminating calls to a mobile phone. That obligation will shift to them now. It used to be the responsibility of the destination of where the call went, but now it's the originator, the actual enterprise that owns it. That's what we have to encourage. That's what we have to promote. And when we do that, it's a recognized cost of doing business. And when that's understood, it's not just a cost, but a protective motion for their customers.
Again, what should healthcare leaders consider when they're selecting technology solutions for their outbound calling operations?
Well, certainly TNS is at the forefront of offering branded name, spoof protection, and logo services. Branded name services allow that critical name display to go onto the mobile phone. And in doing so, it's recognized by the consumer, by the end caller. And when they see the call come in, effectively they know who's calling, and that increases that answer rate, as I mentioned. We also have to take it to another level that includes that spoof protection, that stopping of the imposters that go out and pretend to take a phone number that was originally used or still is used as the main number, say, of a hospital. And if that's the number they want to impersonate, they could get calls answered and trick that end consumer into answering their calls and going down the path of exploiting them. And then finally, we're advancing the technology in a way that allows us to display a logo. So imagine if you are that medical institution or a very familiar pharmaceutical brand and you make a phone call. The logo goes even one step further. It promotes a recognition of a product, of a brand, of a company. So it's kind of like a billboard you drive by. It's an impression. And when you see that, if you don't answer the call, it may still be a call you remember because subconsciously you see that brand. You don't even have to, some cases, you may not even have to put a name, but if you put a logo on the display of a smartphone, I'll let you be the judge of what you'll remember. You will see it, you'll acknowledge it visually, despite whether you answer it. So those calls can be even targeted on different campaigns. And so it's an exciting way to bring marketing into the equation, not just outbound call centers, but marketed approaches to allow the consumer to get an impression of a company that in all likelihood, they might do business in that regional area. So you could be very specifically targeted in demographics that I think really pulls that smartphone in as an advertisement mechanism. A really cool way to use the technology.
That's a great consideration. Maury, thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights with us.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you.
And of course, special thanks to Transaction Network Services for sponsoring this podcast. Have a fantastic rest of your day.